Well, good morning once again, brethren. In the book of Revelation, in the 21st chapter, we read a description of the kingdom of God and those who will be a part of the kingdom of God. In Revelation chapter 21 and verse 7, we read the statement, "He that overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son." And then in verse 8 we read, "But the fearful, and the unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone." This is the second death. Now we find here a category of people. People who are motivated by certain attitudes that take them away from the kingdom of God. Attitudes that have dominated and controlled their lives. Attitudes of fear and doubt. Attitudes of lust and greed. Various attitudes that have taken them away from the kingdom of God. Now, every human being is beset with some of these attitudes at various times. Everyone has encountered fears and doubts. There's not a human being that walks that has not had to encounter such things as fear and doubt. And yet for some, those attitudes become the controlling, ruling factor in their life. And it so swallows up and dominates and controls their life that it controls their future. Now that's contrasted with those who overcome. Those who overcome had to face their fears and their doubts. I would like to call your attention today to a particular example in the Scripture. We will notice several before the sermon is over, but particularly I want to focus at the beginning on an account we read in the book of 1 Samuel. And we will pick up the story back here. The story or the account begins in 1 Samuel chapter 8. I would like for us to in the beginning of the sermon, take a little bit of a look at the life of a man who played a prominent role in the history of ancient Israel. The man who was the first king of ancient Israel. His name was Saul. And I think in many ways his story is perhaps the most tragic story in Scripture. It's the story of a man who had so many opportunities ahead of him. A man who came to junctures in his life, not just one, but several. And we all come to junctures in our life. But Saul began to make some wrong decisions as he came to these junctures. And he took a wrong path. And he came to another juncture and he made another wrong decision and took another wrong path. And over a period of years, his life went into an increasingly downward spiral into darkness. And his end was a very tragic one. His example and his story is given to us in Scripture to show us some things. And there are many examples. The Bible is filled with examples. And all of those examples are there that we might learn from them. Because these were people who encountered problems just like you and I encounter problems. Now Saul was a man who was naturally not a very confident individual. He was evidently a man who was very conscientious. When we're introduced to him here in chapter 8 and 9 of the chapter 8, we're introduced to the fact that the people wanted a king. And in chapter 9, we meet up with Saul. And Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. His family, his father was a man of wealth. And his father had something had happened. He had this herd of donkeys that had somehow disappeared and had gotten away from where they were supposed to be. And so Saul and a servant went to find them. And that's where we're introduced to Saul. And we're introduced to him. The picture we get is here's a man who was diligent. He was out really trying to track down these donkeys that had gotten away and pursued this trip for several days. And finally met up with Samuel and decided that he would, Samuel was God's prophet, and had a gift of prophecy from God, and so Saul thought, well, he would go and consult with Samuel and ask him. Well, unbeknownst to Saul, Samuel had been told by God that Saul was the man that would be anointed as the first king over Israel. Now, Saul, we're told, was a big man. In fact, he stood head and shoulders above all the rest of the people. So he was quite a large man, quite an impressive individual. And yet, Saul does not seem to be an individual who was greatly impressed with himself. In fact, he was, as we see, and the statement was even made of him, he was little in his own eyes. Saul considered himself pretty insignificant. In fact, we could almost say that Saul had a bit of an inferiority complex, because he was a little bit, he was not naturally a bold or a boastful person. In fact, the opposite. Well, Samuel anoints Saul as king here in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1. Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head and kissed him, and said, Is it not because the Eternal has anointed you to be captain over his inheritance? So Saul went forward and found the donkeys where Samuel had told him, and went on back home. And we find that in verse 9, it was so that when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, God gave him another heart, and all those signs came to pass. We're told in verse 10 that the Spirit of God came upon him. He encountered this company of prophets, and he prophesied among them, and that term can have a variety of uses in the context. It may simply involve, it can involve several things. It can involve even a song service, but whatever it was, Saul fit in here. The Spirit of God came upon him, and he played a role here among these prophets. And Saul went on back home. And we read the story here in verse 17 that Samuel called the people together to the Lord to Mizpah and recounted for them several things, and then they had wanted a king, so now they were going to be given a king, and Samuel cast lots, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken, and then in verse 21, the family of Matri was taken, and then from that family or clan, Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. Well, they called his name, and nobody came forward. And they began to look around. Where's Saul? Nobody could find him. Finally, God revealed to Samuel that Saul was hiding. He had hidden among the stuff, we're told in the end of verse 22. The idea of having to get up in front of all those people and make a speech was a little more than what Saul could face. And so when the time came for him to choose to announce the choice, Saul was off hiding. He was, so they ran and they fetched him in verse 23, and he came on out and stood among the people, and he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. He was a huge man. And Samuel said to the people, You see whom the Lord has chosen? There's none like him among the people. And all the people shouted and said, God save the king. And Samuel told the people the manner of the kingdom, wrote it in a book, and laid it up before the Lord. In fact, that's back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. If you want to read that, that ties into, that's what Samuel wrote and laid it up before the Lord. Been covering some of that in the Bible studies. Saul went home to Gibeon, and there were some men whom God had motivated to go with him, and they went with him. Now, evidently not much happened about this time. Saul didn't maybe know quite what to do, so he went back home. He had been anointed king, and now there were some fellows that went with him. And he went back there to the farm. And in the meantime, in chapter 11, we read of Nahash the Ammonite. And he came up and encamped at Jabesh Gilead, and he decided that not only was he going to conquer this village, he was going to humiliate the village. And he demanded their surrender and told them that he was going to blind everyone there. All the men he was going to blind them in their right eye. So he was a cruel sort of fella, and had come up and threatened, he said, that's the good news. That's the best I'm going to do. If you make me conquer you, I'm going to kill the whole bunch of you. Well, they were scared, and they didn't know what to do, and they sent a messenger to Saul. They had a new king, see. Well, they got there, and Saul was out in the field, and so they told the people, And the messengers of Gibeah came. And when Saul came after the herd out of the field, verse 5 of chapter 11, all the people were all upset and carrying on. Saul said, "What's going on?" They told him the story. And so Saul sent for an army and and this huge group of Israelites came there together. And Saul came the next day and absolutely overwhelmed these Ammonites and scattered them. So now all of a sudden Saul is popular and people are Samuel told them, verse 14, he sent to the people, said, "Come, let's go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom." So now Saul seems like he's sort of off to a start. He's taking charge finally. He's been a little reluctant to do that. So they said, let's renew the kingdom. So they went to Gilgal and renewed the kingdom. And Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now, Samuel then speaks to the people. This is recorded in chapter 12. Gives them an admonition. Time goes by. We pick up the beginning of the second half of Saul's reign, beginning in chapter 13. And we find that there has been problems. You see, Israel has been beset by all these foreign nations, particularly the Philistines, but the Ammonites and some of the others have come in as well. And the people have been terrorized. As you read the story on through here, and we'll come across portions of it, you find that in some cases people were just scattered out. They were hiding. They were terrorized. These marauding bands would come in and would put fire to the crops in the villages. We find that the Philistines had put a stop to any metalworking in Israel. There was not a smith to be found throughout all Israel. If you wanted your axe or your hoe sharpened, your plow sharpened, you had to go down to one of the Philistine villages and get them to do it, because the Philistines didn't want anybody among the Israelites who would be making swords and spears. So they had, it shows you the kind of control that the Philistines had when they were able to literally put a stop to metalworking, either chase out or kill any of the smiths in Israel. So you find, as you come on down through the story in chapter 13, verse 22, that Saul and Jonathan were the only two men in Israel that had a spear and a sword. Wherever they'd managed to get one somewhere. Well, as we pick up the story in chapter 13, things have gone on, and not a whole lot has happened. Saul has been a little slow to take charge when the event has sort of thrust upon him. He has. And now the Philistines have been terrorizing Israel. So they are to be gathered together to Gilgal, or gathered here. And they're going to gather together to Gilgal. And then are going to go forth to battle against the Philistines. Samuel was to come there and preside over the occasion, and of course only the Levites, the priests, were to offer sacrifices. Well, they came there to Gilgal, and there was a set time for Samuel to come after 7 days, and the 7 days went by, and Samuel hadn't come. And in the meantime, the people were beginning to just sort of melt away. Now, to get an idea, verse 6, when the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, the people hid themselves in caves, in thickets, and rocks, and high places, and pits. Some of the Hebrews went over Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. And as for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So everybody has headed, they spooked like a covey of quails. They all headed every which way. Some of them crossed the river and they got out of town. Others were hiding in the caves, hiding in the woods. Saul had this little army, and it says they were following him trembling. And Saul was sort of nervous himself. They waited there 7 days, and Samuel hadn't showed up yet. And his army, this little army that had followed him, they were beginning to melt away. And Saul decided, he made a fateful decision at this point, that he would offer the burnt offering himself. Now, he had been specifically instructed not to wait for Samuel to do it. And the law specifically instructed that. And yet, Saul was scared. From his standpoint, what he could see was everything melting away. And he got scared, and so he decided, he would take matters into his own hands. And as soon as he made an end of offering the burnt offering, in verse 10, Samuel showed up. Isn't it amazing how that happens sometimes? And Saul went out to meet him, and Samuel said, "What have you done?" You see, obviously God was testing Saul here, and Samuel being late. Saul had already, a period of time had gone by in his reign. Chapter 13:1 renders it that he's reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. This is if you put the whole story together here in Chronicles, you find out that this was the second half of his reign. I don't have time to go back into all the history of it, but the literal Hebrew is he was the son of 1 year in his reigning, and there's some other verses when you put it together that sort of show this, that some time has transpired, but now he has set up a capital and is actually functioning as king. And so he encounters this test, and he's scared, and so he decides sort of take matters into his own hands. And Saul was told by Samuel that he had done foolishly. He had specifically violated the commandment of the Lord. And see, that's always a foolish thing when we violate God's commandment. Now, Samuel arose, left from Gilgal. In verse 15, Saul numbered the people that were present with him, and he had about 600 men. He started out with 3,000 in verse 2, so his army sort of melted down, and those, we're told, followed him trembling. So anyway, they go up, and we read the story that they scattered this group of Philistines and overwhelmed this garrison of the Philistines there at Michmash. And then chapter 14 tells the story that a little while later, Saul decides that he is going to war with the Philistines, and it tells the story of Jonathan, Saul's son, who, together with his armor bearer, comes in and takes this fortified place that the Philistines had been occupying, and Saul and his armies pursue after them. And so in verse 23, the Lord saved Israel that day. Now, in verse 24, we find that Saul had done something that wasn't real smart. Saul had taken a vow on behalf of all the people. And his vow was, in verse 24, "Cursed be the man that eats any food until evening, that I may be avenged on my enemies." And none of the people tasted any food. And what you find is, of course, that the people were worn out. Here they were in pursuit all day. They weren't supposed to eat, and they were expending a lot of energy. They were hungry. They were just exhausted. We're told in the end of verse 28 that the people were faint. You know, Saul had made a vow, taken an oath that wasn't very smart. Now his son Jonathan had actually not heard what Saul had said. And so they're coming through the woods, and they come on this tree where there has been this big swarm of bees, and here's this huge hive, and it's just loaded with honey. Well, Jonathan sees it, and boy, he thinks that looks great, and so he sticks in his spear, and he breaks off a piece of this honeycomb, and eats this honey and honeycomb, and he's feeling good and looking around, sort of surprised nobody else is doing it, and they said, "Well, look, your father took an oath and pronounced a curse on anybody that tasted any food." See, Jonathan hadn't heard that. And Jonathan said in verse 29, "Well, I'm afraid my father's troubled the land. You know, look how much better I feel because I tasted a little of this honey. If he'd allowed the rest of you to eat, how much more would we have gotten accomplished this day?" Well, they defeated the Philistines, and when they got there, by now, then they took the spoil. Well, now the people are so tired, so hungry, that they flew upon the sheep and the oxen, the spoil, slew them on the ground, verse 32, didn't take time to properly drain the meat and let the blood get out. And so here they were, just jumping in, quickly slaughtering these animals. They were eating them. They were about half raw, and the blood was still in the meat, and which was exactly forbidden, you see, that you weren't supposed to eat the blood. So somebody came and told Saul, said, "The people are eating, they're going to provoke God. They're eating with the blood." And so Saul, and the reason, of course, was they were so quick to jump in on this because they were hungry. Well, Saul told them to have everybody bring their animals over here to slaughter, and so they got a handle on that, and they were properly slaughtered. And Saul built an altar there, verse 15. It was the first altar he had built. And Saul is now preparing to go and attack the Philistines. And there's no answer from God as he inquires of God. So he wonders where the problem is. Finally comes down that Jonathan, that there has been something that has happened. Saul has taken this oath, and of course then it comes to light that Jonathan had eaten the honey. Well, Saul was impetuous, and he said, well, I said that it'd be a curse on anybody that did that, and so, Jonathan will have to take responsibility, even if he didn't hear it. He'll have to be killed. And the people said, verse 45, forget that. No way. Jonathan was the hero. Hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have even won the battle. So Saul backed down and went up from following the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. So Saul now took the kingdom over Israel. In verse 47, now about the second half of his reign, he has finally gotten into gear. He is fighting against enemies on every side. And now there's this group of Amalekites, and Samuel comes to Saul, and he says, God has a special commission for you. The Amalekites are to be totally wiped out. None of their produce, their animals, nothing is to be saved. Well, we find that in chapter 15, verse 1, Samuel sent to Saul, and he said, the Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over his people. Now hearken to the voice of the words of the Lord. See, Saul had an opportunity at an earlier time. One thing about a test from God, if you flunk the test, sooner or later it's going to come around again. If you don't like going through it, then, we have to learn the lesson we need to learn so that we can proceed on to the next thing. Well, here, Saul had a problem with following instructions. And the problem that he had with following instructions was that his fears increasingly were the ruling factor in his life. Saul, we're going to see that as we go on. So you see, earlier Saul had been scared. That's why he didn't follow God's instructions. He was scared. He was facing battle. Samuel hadn't showed up yet. And so he specifically disobeyed instructions, thinking that, offering a sacrifice was going to solve the problem. And ultimately, there's a lesson here. Now, as we come on in chapter 15, Samuel gives Saul specific instructions from God. And he says, now, God has anointed you king. Go out and follow these instructions. So Saul gathered together the people and went out to attack the Amalekites. And it tells the battle, and Saul won the battle. And then we find that Samuel comes to Saul. And verse 13. And Saul sees him, and he's happy, and he says, blessed be you of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Boy, I did it right this time. And Samuel said to Saul, well, if you did it right this time, then what's all this bleating of sheep and lowing of oxen that I hear? What's all this noise? Where all these animals come from? And Samuel said, well, now they brought them, the people, they brought them from the Amalekites. The people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to God. That's why they did that. The rest of it we utterly destroyed. And Saul was told by Samuel. Now I want you to listen to something. When you were little in your own sight, you were made head of the tribes of Israel. The Lord anointed you king. The Lord sent you on a journey. Verse 18, He gave you instructions. Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites. Fight against them until they're consumed. Why didn't you obey the voice of the Lord? You flew upon the spoil and did evil in the sight of the Lord. And Saul said, well, I did obey the voice of the Lord. I've done what God sent me to do. Verse 21, but the people took of the spoil. They took of the sheep and the oxen and the cheap things that were to be utterly destroyed. They were planning on offering it as a sacrifice down in Gilgal. And Samuel said to Saul, verse 22, has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, He's rejected you from being king. And Saul said to Samuel, well, I've sinned. I've transgressed the commandments of the Lord and your words because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now we come to the problem, the crux of the problem. Saul's fear stood in the way of his obedience. You see, at an earlier time, when originally he was to go out, first big problem, Saul got scared. He saw the army sort of melting down. He was facing this problem, decided that because Samuel hadn't showed up to offer the sacrifice, he ought to go ahead and do it. He was motivated by fear. That wasn't good. Well, time went by. He had opportunities to go through different things. And now, a different problem confronts him. And this time, he's given unmistakable instructions, very clear instructions. And they get there and they follow it partially. The people wanted to keep some of the spoil. And Saul was afraid. He wanted to be popular. He wanted to be liked. He wanted the approval of the people. And so he backed down and he let them do what they wanted to do. And Samuel told Saul, the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel because of this. And then it turned out that not only had Saul spared the best of the sheep and the oxen, he hadn't even executed the king of the Amalekites. They'd taken care of all the rest of them, or many of the others, but here was the king who was the ringleader. If anybody should have been executed, should have been him. And here old Agag. Samuel said, bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came unto him delicately. You can imagine old Agag wasn't real happy about showing up out there. He was sort of hoping to hide back behind something and hope that Samuel would leave, because evidently he had sort of made some sort of a deal with Saul. Well, and then Agag comes out, and he says, well, surely the bitterness of death is past. Bygones be bygones. Let's all be friends. And Samuel says, no way. As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel executed him. And Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went to his house in Gibeah. So here we find this incident that shows, you see, Saul was not following God's instructions. His fears were increasingly a controlling factor in his life, giving in to these fears because he wanted the approval of the people. Well, Samuel felt badly about it. God told him in chapter 16, how long are you going to mourn for Saul? I've got a job for you to do. Go down and anoint David to be king, a man after my own heart. So we read the story here in chapter 16. Now, notice what we're told in verse 14 of 1 Samuel 16. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. We find that Saul has made a progression from a fresh young man who was anxious to do what God says to an individual who has become increasingly fearful. And his fears have taken him further and further away from God. We have to realize we're reading a summary of events right now that have occupied about 25 years to transpire. So we're not looking at, as you just read it through without putting together the whole chronology of it, you don't realize how quickly this has transpired. But we're looking about a period of about 15 years at least, or 25 years rather, at least 25 years that have transpired. And here we encounter now this event. And here Saul has now gotten to the point that he has become so fearful, so morose and brooding, that now he begins to be troubled by a demon spirit. And at this time, initially, the decision is made to look for someone who is a skillful musician. Music sets an atmosphere and a mood. You can set any mood you want with music. You can create something that's happy and exciting, an atmosphere of majesty and awe. You can also create very negative moods with music. And that's why the wrong use of music, Satan, Lucifer was created with tremendous musical abilities, became perverted in all his ways. Music can work people up into a frenzy. It can calm and soothe. It can do a wide variety of things, and we've all experienced that. Hollywood spends millions to put the proper music into a movie or a television production. And it enhances the action. You've all watched a mystery where something was going to happen, and the music, you're not really thinking consciously that much about it, but the music in the background is sort of building the suspense. And they've literally hooked people up, to things to monitor their blood pressure and their pulse and see the great difference that it makes. You can calm people, you can excite people, you can get them sort of sitting on the edge of their seat. We've all remember the old, the Lone Ranger riding across chasing the bad guys, and you hear the music in the background, and if you hear it and don't see that, you can just picture it in your mind. Here David came, and he wasn't playing some, wild stuff. He was playing something calm and soothing there to sort of create a positive mood, to help Saul to relax and to create a good atmosphere. And this Saul would this was helpful for a time. But what we find is Saul continued to get worse. So Saul was refreshed, when David would play for him. He'd get in a good mood, and it's just the whole atmosphere would change. Because as we read here, one of the things we learn is that our attitudes and moods can make us receptive to Satan's influence, and it can tune out Satan's influence. We are receptive to God, or we're receptive to Satan. Saul became increasingly in a mood that made him receptive to Satan's influence, and that made him very unreceptive to God's influence. Well, chapter 17 tells a story that we're all familiar with about David and Goliath. The Philistines were encamped to battle against Israel, and for 40 days, almost 6 weeks, every day, this giant from the Philistines has come down here into the valley, and he has bellowed out a challenge to the Israelites. He said, pick out one man. Send me your biggest, your best. Send him down here and I'll fight with him. We don't have to all of our armies fight. Just 2 of us. You send me your champion. And he fights with me, and whoever wins, that's the winner. Well, they've had 6 weeks and nobody showed up. So you sort of get the idea that nobody is anxious to go. Now, remember what we read about Saul earlier? He was head and shoulders above all the rest of the people. He was the biggest guy the Israelites had. He wasn't as big as Goliath, but he was bigger than anybody else in Israel. Don't you suspect that by this time people have been buzzing and saying, well, look, somebody needs to do something? But really, I think Saul's the one that ought to go down there. I mean, after all, he's the king. He's the biggest guy we've got. He needs to go down there. Something needs to be done. Well, they haven't done anything. Now, David, who evidently is a teenager, according to the story, would be in his late teens, but we know he's younger than 20 because otherwise he'd have been down there in the army. He comes down there because his brothers are all older. He's the youngest one in the group. His brothers are all older. They're all in the army. He comes down from his dad, comes from the farm, and he's bringing some food for his brothers. His dad sent a care package. Gets there just about in time for Goliath to come out there for his afternoon stroll, stands out there, challenges the Israelites, and David is just amazed. He sees this guy come out here, and he issues this just insulting challenge. And David says, who is that guy? Who is that uncircumcised Philistine? That he should challenge the armies of the living God. And people said, you better get down and shut up or he's going to see you. Boy, he eats people like you for lunch. You better not mess with him. And David said, I'm not afraid of him. I'm not afraid of him. Who does he think he is? Nobody else will fight him. I will. Well, eventually they sent David down to Saul. And David told Saul in verse 32, he said, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, well, you're not able to go up against him. You're still a kid. You're just a young fella. He's been a man of war for years. And David said to Saul, well, I may be young, but I've kept my father's sheep. And one time there came a lion, another time a bear that took the lamb out of the flock, and I went after him. And with God's help, I killed him. And I got the lamb back. I'm not afraid. I'll go down there. Because he says in verse 36, your servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, the Lord has delivered me out of the paw of the lion, and out of the paw of the bear, and he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, well, go, and the Lord be with you. Well, first Saul wanted him to put on his armor. Well, that just swallowed David up. He couldn't wear that. So he took it off, took his staff, verse 40, picked up 5 little smooth stones out of the brook. People say, well, why did he pick up 5? Well, I don't know exactly. Maybe, I guess he figured there's always a chance he could miss with the first one, have a little bit in reserve. He took 5 stones. He stepped out in faith, but he had his part to do. And so they came down there. Well, when the Philistine drew near to David, he saw David, and he was contemptuous of David and just furious. And the Philistine said to David, verse 43, am I a dog? You've come out here with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Boy, you can better believe he could really roll out a whole bunch. He called David every bad name he could think of. He invoked all of his gods, and he said every sort of ugly name he could think of. And David told the Philistine, verse 45, he says, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to you in the name of the Eternal of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've destroyed. This day will the Lord deliver you into my hand, and I'm going to smite you and take your head from you. And I'm going to give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day to the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all of this assembly, all of these armies, shall know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. The Philistine arose, and boy, he was mad. And David hastened and ran toward him, put his hand in the bag, drew out a stone, swung the slingshot. The stone went flying, hit Goliath right square between the eyes. And the bigger they were, the harder they fell. Goliath just fell flat down on his face, dead. That was it. It was over. Now, David came in faith. His confidence was not on the fact that I'm the greatest thing that ever came. David did not go out to battle like Muhammad Ali, that he was the greatest. I am the greatest. No, David's focus was on God. He said, look, I know that God will take care of this. God has helped me in what I needed to face in the past. I had a responsibility to take care of the sheep, and I was willing to step out in faith and to do it, and God backed me up. God blessed me. God has helped me, and I know that God will help me to take care of this fellow because he's out here insulting God. The battle is the Lord's. Now, we, at this point, encounter a marked difference in the heart of David and in the heart of Saul. Well, that we find as we come on down in chapter 6, verse 18, chapter 6, David returned from the slaughter of the Philistines. The women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played. They were singing and making music. And part of the song said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they've ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed but thousands. What can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. The next day, an evil spirit was troubling Saul, and he was raving there in the midst of the house, and David picked up the harp and began to play soothing music like he had done in the past. And Saul is there, and he's got this javelin in his hand, and he just reaches and grabs it and throws the javelin at David and says, I'll smite David to the wall. This is what he's thinking. Well, David jumped out of his way twice. Verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. So Saul sent him out to battle. David behaved wisely in all his ways. The Lord was with him. Verse 15, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. All Israel and Judah loved David because he went in and out before them. Well, in verse 28, Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. And the princes of the Philistines went forth, and came to pass as they went forth, David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul. His name was much sent by. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. Now notice the deterioration. Here Saul is becoming so obsessed with David. You see, he feels threatened by David's popularity. David is the thing, represents those things that Saul isn't and wishes he were. Instead of Saul changing, Saul has become increasingly obsessed, and now he's jealous of David. And he's fearful of David's popularity and the fact that David is more popular. And so he is increasingly morose, he is increasingly filled with fear and resentment as the controlling factors in his life. He is being more and more troubled by demon spirits as he is in this attitude that makes him very receptive to Satan's influence. Well, David gets out of the way. Jonathan warns him about what's happening, and David escaped. And we find that as the story goes on in chapter 21, David came to Nob, which was the city of the priest, to Ahimelech the priest, and gets some food there from them. And while he's there, one of Saul's servants, Doeg the Edomite, sees what's going on. So a little later, David has fled, chapter 22, verse 1, to the cave of Adullam. And he's collected people there. David's simply trying to get out of the way. Well, Saul found out that the priest had given David some food, and so he decides to kill the priests. And he issues the order to his men to kill the priests. And they at least have more fear of God than they do of Saul. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. Doeg the Edomite, this idolater, he's not afraid. He has no respect for God or for his priests. And so he slaughtered the priests there at Nob and smote it with the edge of the sword. We're told in chapter 22, verse 19. And so as we go on through the story, we find that on several occasions, David and Saul have encounters that, and we find that Saul, instead of spending his energy pursuing the Philistines, the enemies of Israel, is increasingly his energy and his time. He's become so obsessed with David that he's taking his army, and instead of fighting the enemies of the nation, he's chasing David all around Israel. David's just trying to stay out of his way. And we find that David managed to do that. And as you come on through the story, we find here in chapter 24, Saul took 3,000 chosen men, and he went to seek David and his men among the rocks and the wild goats. Now here's sort of a funny story. They've come up here, and David and his men are hiding in this cave. And Saul's got this army of 3,000 people, and he's chasing around, spending all of his time. He's become absolutely obsessed with David. He gets up here to where David is hiding. Of course, he doesn't know which cave David's hiding in. He just knows he's in the general area. And he's got to go to the bathroom, so he goes into a cave. And he takes his long robe off and lays it down and goes back there in a corner. Well, what he doesn't know is David and his men are actually hiding in that very cave. And so somebody gets the bright idea, wouldn't it be funny to cut the skirt of the robe off? He's laid this thing down over there and gone back there to the back corner. Let's just take our sword and we just cut the skirt of it off. And so Saul comes back and he, puts his robe on and he goes out. Well, it's dark in there, and when he gets out, all of a sudden he looks down, he's got this mini skirt on. Because David has cut the skirt off. Well, now David begins to feel badly about that. You know, Saul comes out, and you can imagine, it doesn't take long, everybody begins to snicker and laugh. Something has happened. You know, Saul comes out looking ridiculous with this thing. And David gets to feeling so badly about it because, you know, here I have humiliated the king, that David actually comes out of the cave and apologizes. And tells Saul, he said, look, why are you chasing me all over the place? If I were your enemy, I could have killed you. I just cut the skirt of your robe off. I could have killed you if I'd wanted to. You were right in here. You were defenseless. Can't you get this out of your mind that I'm your enemy? I'm not trying to hurt you. Well, Saul felt badly, and I'm sorry, and everything. You're more righteous than I am. Verse 17, Saul said, you've rewarded me good, and I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to be better. Well, no. You get on to the next chapter, and you find out, same thing. Same thing. Chapter 26. Saul is out chasing David again. And they come to a point, and Saul and his army is camped down here. And David and a couple of guys come sneaking down to the camp, and there's Saul lying right there. And they come to a point, and Saul and his army is camped down here. And David and a couple of guys come sneaking down to the camp, and there's Saul lying right there. And so they come down there, and Saul's right here in his water bottle and his spear. And they take the water bottle and the spear, and they get out of there. And nobody woke up. And then David went to the other side. This is in chapter 26, down around verses 12 and 13. And David calls out and gets everybody's attention. They all wake up and start scrambling around. And here's the guy they've been looking for, and he's standing right up there. And he told Saul, he said, I've got your spear. If I were your enemy and were trying to kill you, I could have just stuck it through you. I'm not your enemy. Can't you get that through your head? And Saul said, oh yes, you're not my enemy. I'm sorry. Well, same old thing. Well, the story ends up, of course, as you know, in the latter part of the book, here in chapter 29, in chapter 28, Saul has now gotten so far away from God that he gets no answers, and so he goes to consult a witch, a fortune teller. And then finally, at the very end of the book, of course, Saul is wounded in battle and commits suicide and dies by his own hand. A tragic story. A man who became overwhelmed by his fears. His fear came to rule the life of Saul. You know, we all have fears. The problem was that Saul kept giving in to his. And his fear overwhelmed his faith. And instead of obedience, Saul pursued the path of disobedience. And then the fear led into obsession. And he became absolutely obsessed with what he viewed as threats. David he viewed as a threat. Became so obsessed with David that he couldn't do what he was supposed to do. Couldn't really serve as king for the people and contending with the things that needed to be addressed, because he was charging around trying to get David. David was, in reality, the best friend that Saul had. In David, Saul had someone that really cared about him and would not want to hurt him. But you see, Saul completely lost touch with reality. He lost touch with God and deteriorated into just an increasing spiral downward into darkness. A very tragic story of a man whose life came to be ruled and controlled by his fears. Now, I want to call your attention to something else. Let's look at something different. Back in John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, we read the story of Christ's final Passover, and we read about the foot washing here in chapter 13. And Jesus, we're told, had began to wash the disciples' feet, and he told Peter in verse 10 of John 13, he that is washed needs not except to wash his feet. He is clean every whit, and you're clean, but not all. Now what he meant by that is brought out in verse 11. He knew who should betray him. Therefore he said, you're not all clean. After he washed their feet, took his garments, and he sat down and began to talk to them. Well, as you come on down through the story, we find that Judas entered into Satan, or Satan entered into Judas, and Judas went out to betray him. Now, notice what we have brought out here in verse 18. Christ told them in verse 17, this is right before Judas left, if you know these things, happy are you if you do them. Verse 18, I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled, he that eats bread with me lifts up his heel against me. And I tell you before it comes, so that after it comes to pass, you may believe that I am. Jesus quoted a verse from Psalm 41, verse 9. He quoted Psalm 41, verse 9, and applied it as a prophecy to Judas. He that eats bread with me shall lift up his heel against me. So we see in the account of Christ's final supper, we see his betrayal by Judas, and we see that there was a prophecy in the Old Testament in Psalm 41 that Jesus quoted and said was a prophecy of Judas. Now let's go back to Psalm 41, and I want to show you that statement in its context. And let's understand the background for what was originally written. In Psalm 41, we read that this is a psalm of David. It was written by David at a low point in his life, and it referred to incidents that David himself was going through, one of which was prophetic of what Judas would do. Now, in chapter 41 of Psalms, verse 1, blessed is he that considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive. He will be blessed upon the earth. Verse 3, the Lord will strengthen him upon the bed of languishing. Verse 4, I said, Lord, be merciful unto me. Heal my soul. I've sinned against you. My enemies speak evil of me. When shall he die and his name perish? If he comes to see me, he speaks vanity. His heart gathers iniquity to itself. When he goes abroad, he tells it. He comes, he acts like he's my friend. He's really just coming to sort of find out the scoop, and then he goes and he spreads rumors. Verse 7, all that hate me whisper together against me they devise hurt. An evil disease cleaves to him. They say, they think I'm going to die. Verse 9, yes, my own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. David is at a low point in his life, is contending with an individual that was his familiar friend, his close friend, who has turned against him and has actually become a type of Judas Iscariot. That's what we learn from John 13:18. Now let's go a little further, because I'm going to show you who this friend is. In coming on over back to Psalm 55, another prophecy, or another psalm along this line, Psalm 55, verse 1, give ear to my prayer, O God. Hide not yourself from my supplication. Attend unto me. Hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise. Because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. They cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. My heart is sore pained within me. The terrors of death are fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me. Horror has overwhelmed me. And I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, then I'd fly away and be at rest. You see, brethren, David had to contend with fear as well, didn't he? Everybody does. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me. Horror has overwhelmed me. David came to the same juncture in his life that Saul came in his. He was beset with problems. He was overwhelmed. He said, I wish I could just grow wings and fly away and get away from all this. You ever felt that way? Just beset with everything. You wish you could just sprout wings and fly away. I guess probably just about all of us felt that way at one time or another. David did. He said, if I could do this, verse 8, I'd hasten my escape from the windy storm and the tempest. Then he prays to God. And verse 11, he says, wickedness is in the midst thereof, deceit and guile depart not from her streets. For it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then would I have hidden myself from him. But it was you, a man my equal, my guide, my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked in the house of God in company. That was the hard thing for David. It was his friend. It was the person he trusted the most. It was his chief counselor. They had walked in the temple or in the tabernacle together, walked up to the courtyard of the tabernacle. They had spent hours together. They had eaten meals together. My familiar friend in whom I trusted. My guide, my counselor. The person I looked to more than any other. Well, as we read back in the book of 1 Samuel, we find, or rather in the book of 2 Samuel, 2 Samuel 15, we find out about this man. The story, the time setting of these Psalms, by the way, is the time when David was, this great crisis of David's life, when he had to flee from Absalom, his son. He had to flee from Jerusalem, and he got the news during this time, as he fled from Absalom, chapter 15 of 2 Samuel. In verse 12 of 2 Samuel 15, we find that Absalom had sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor. He'd sent from him from his cities, from Gilo, where he'd offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, and the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David and said, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. So David fled from Jerusalem. And as the story comes on down, we find by the time we get down the latter part of the verse, or the latter part of the chapter, here David is fleeing from Jerusalem, coming up to the Mount of Olives. In verse 31, one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. This was sort of the crowning blow. Ahithophel had been David's friend, David's chief counselor. We're going to see that as we go on. David prayed to God that he would turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. You see, what we find is that Ahithophel was an individual of great insight. In fact, we're told in 2 Samuel 16:23 that the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, it was if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Ahithophel always had the right answer. He was an individual of tremendous wisdom. He had been that way with David. David trusted Ahithophel. Now, Ahithophel had turned as a conspirator to overthrow David's kingdom and to establish Absalom. Well, as you come on down through the story in chapter 17, God had purposed, in the end of verse 14, the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. It was not God's purpose to see Absalom established in the kingdom, and so God worked circumstances out so that Ahithophel's counsel was ignored. And Ahithophel at this point saw the handwriting on the wall. And so, verse 23, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel wasn't followed, he saddled his ass, arose, got home to his house, to his city, put his household in order, and hung himself and died. Ahithophel committed suicide rather than face the consequences of his actions. He had betrayed his friend, the king. Had been part of a conspiracy, and now he saw the whole conspiracy falling apart. Ahithophel had come to a great juncture in his life, and he had made the wrong decision. Do you know why he made it? Let me show you something here. Just a couple of verses. We'll have to compare them. In 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, we're reading about the story of David's seduction of Bathsheba. Remember David's adultery with Bathsheba? 2 Samuel 11, verse 3, David sent and inquired after the woman, and someone told him, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now let's turn back to 2 Samuel 23. 2 Samuel 23. Here we read at about the end of David's life and this recounting of the mighty men who served David. David's closest group and what they did and the exploits of these mighty men. Notice here in verse 34. It mentions Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai. He was the son of a Maacathite. And, the end of verse 34, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. Ahithophel's son was Eliam, and Eliam's daughter was Bathsheba. Ahithophel was none other than Bathsheba's grandfather. Now does the story begin to make sense? You see, David had gotten involved in this adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. committed adultery with her, and you remember the story. Later married her. She was the mother of King Solomon, by the way. Obviously, Ahithophel had never forgiven David for what he had done. In the aftermath of that event, David, who had been his closest friend, Ahithophel never forgave him. Ahithophel became increasingly consumed with resentment and bitterness about David and what David had done. And when Ahithophel came to a crucial juncture in his life, this rebellion of Absalom began to spring up. Ahithophel asked the wrong question. You see, the question Ahithophel should have asked is, where is God working? Through Absalom or through David? Ahithophel should have sought to be where God was working. Where was God working? He wasn't working through Absalom. But that's not the question Ahithophel asked. He was an individual of great wisdom. He could have had insight into seeing where was God working. Ahithophel chose not to look for that because he had become so filled with bitterness that had eaten on him for this period of several years, that when he had the chance, he was going to get even and to finish off David. That was the story. My own familiar friend in whom I've trusted. He that ate bread with me lifted up his heel against me. If it had been an enemy, I could have stood it, but it was my friend, my counselor, the man with whom I spent hours. Ahithophel ultimately became the Old Testament type of Judas Iscariot. Jesus quoted the verse from Psalm 41 and applied it to Judas. The verse that had originally been inspired by Ahithophel's actions. The point is, brethren, you look at Saul, you look at Ahithophel. You look at individuals who came to junctures in their life and they made a wrong choice. They were beset with the same things that beset all of us. We all are faced with fears. We're all faced with things that we resent, with hurts, with all sorts of things. The point is, how do we respond when we come to that juncture in our lives? Here are the stories of individuals who increasingly went down the wrong path at that juncture, and eventually it brought about their destruction. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, the faith chapter. We read back here in Hebrews 11, latter part of the chapter, verse 31. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. What shall I say more? Time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and of Samson and Jephthah, and David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Out of weakness they were made strong. The heroes of faith didn't start out just naturally as heroes of faith. They were human beings, just like you and I are, men and women, who faced the same fears, the same problems, the same resentments, the same difficulties of life. You can go through, and as Paul says here, time would fail me to tell, and time is also running out for me, so I can't tell you about all of these. But you can go back and you can read the story. You know, when you're introduced to Gideon, he's hiding out behind the wine press with his little handful of wheat, trying to winnow his wheat. You know, he's got this little tiny handful and he's blowing on it. He's hiding behind the wine press because he's scared to death of the Midianites who've been coming in and stealing the crops and burning the place down. And an angel appears to Gideon and says, "Stand up, you mighty man of valor." And Gideon starts looking around trying to figure out who's being talked to. And the angel says, "God has a job for you. There's a big statue of Baal right here in your hometown, right in your village. You need to go destroy that thing. God's going to use you to deliver Israel." You know, Gideon was scared to death about that. Now, he didn't want to go out and destroy that idol. In fact, it's an interesting story. You go through and you read the thing. It's how Gideon sought to respond to God. He wanted to obey God. So he decided, got a bright idea. He thought, I'll go out and do it at midnight. Everybody will be asleep and nobody will know who did it. All God said was I had to destroy it. I'll destroy it. But I'll do it at night. Nobody will know. And so Gideon was a man who was not controlled by his fears, but they were there. They were working on him. But he stepped out in faith. He believed God. God said destroy it, so he destroyed it. And of course, you know, you can't keep a secret. By the next morning, amazingly enough, within a short time, people figured out who did it. God went on to use Gideon in a mighty way to deliver Israel. You see, the men of faith, out of weakness, were made strong. Brethren, you and I encounter things in our lives. And God gives us examples of individuals who gave in to the wrong feelings and the wrong emotions, which increasingly, over a period of years, came to dominate their lives and to lead them further and further away from a relationship with God until ultimately it became their destruction. The Bible also tells the story of individuals who encountered the same problems and the same fears. And they were just as human. And David, you read the Psalms, there were times that David was absolutely overwhelmed, wish he could just fly away from it all. But instead, he turned to God and besought God, and God helped him. You see, the 23rd Psalm is part of what David learned in the depths of his fears. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you're with me. You see, that was the lesson of faith that David learned in the depths of his despair. He turned to God rather than as Saul, who sought to solve his problems his own way and became increasingly overwhelmed by his desire to fix it, and then obsessed with his fear about those who were doing what they ought to do. Well, I hope that as we look at these examples, that we can understand more fully the contrast of those who are labeled as overcomers. To him that overcomes, will I grant to sit with me in my throne, Christ said. It is to face the negative feelings of life, and with the power and the help of God, that out of weakness we also might be made strong.